Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. Kane. We left you on a cliffhanger last time. The John A. Macdonald government had just been overturned, and now we got our first Liberal government. So would it be much different?
Well, I don't know, but I think John A. Macdonald started flipping burgers around then.
Yeah,
that time, and just started the whole McDonald franchise. It wasn't Ray Kroc at all. It was
that's what it says on his Wikipedia page. I'm not sure if that's true or not.
Yeah, you know, the more things change, the more things stay the same. In this case, not so much, because people had thought that the Conservatives had become a bit corrupt, you know, a bit kind of cocky, and so the Liberals, the teetotal party, the ones that alcohol never touched their lips, they were going to be, you know, coming in, clean sweep, you know, change absolutely everything. So there is actually quite a bit of change with the Liberals, whether you support them in the modern period or not. They're really good here. So the elections called for 1874, and the Liberal leader, Alexander Mackenzie, and his party won. Yay! So we got our second Scottish Prime Minister, because he's still a Scot, yeah.
2-0.
So he's also Scottish, but he's the opposite of John A. Macdonald almost every way. He's kind of a dour man, you know, not Calvinisty. Well, he's not Calvinist, but you know, that kind of like, oh, a smell shall never cross my lips kind of person. An advocate of temperance, the temperance movement. He was a stonemason by trade, not a lawyer like the rest of them. And I think he was an evangelical Baptist, and he expected, he's the opposite of Macdonald in so many different ways. The books that have lots of anecdotal information about Macdonald always say, you know, what a nice guy he was and stuff, and how he knew everybody's name in the house, even if they were in the opposition. He always had a good word for everybody. And these guys are just like, well, people should just act properly all the time, and then they'd be really disappointed when they didn't. But Macdonald was always kind of like, you know, chamber pot's poured on your head, just smile and say, oh, sure. You know, he's just like crazy cool. Yeah, I can tell I'm quite taken with him. So Mackenzie's no charmer, but he's a really hard worker, and he gets a bit of short shrift from historians, because he doesn't really believe that you should do everything you can to get the railway in place, and you know, and he doesn't know how to delegate, and doesn't have parties and stuff. So so as Prime Minister, he took on the portfolio of public works, and so looked into the railway survey himself, and didn't kind of wine and dine people. After Mackenzie, the next Liberal leader is going to be Edward Blake. He takes over the leadership of the party, I think, in 1880, and Blake, again, you know, Upper Canada College, U of T, considered one of the greatest lawyers and legal minds in Canada, clinical debater, no trace of emotion. In fact, he debates John A. Macdonald, the Pacific scandal, and he's the guy that Macdonald's really worried that he'll be able to really put a dent in it, because he says stuff like, oh, well, if you were so sure that the people loved you, and why did you have to buy their votes or something? Or, oh, you weren't saying that when you were putting money in their pockets. So he's kind of boring, and so is Mackenzie. He has no need to denounce a Prime Minister for that. But Mackenzie becomes Prime Minister and realises, of course he did before he came to the position, realises that there's unacceptable levels of patronage in politics. Not what you know, it's who you know. And he also thought that the political machinery, the political structure of the country needed an overhaul, and this is only, you know, less than a decade after Confederation. So as I said, historians haven't really been all that kind to him, because he's too puritanical, he's not fun-loving, and while he accepted eventually that he had to build this transcontinental railroad, he wasn't too happy about it, and so he said, you know, the pace will be slower, and then people were like, oh, you can't slow down the pace, sorry buddy. So you thought that it shouldn't take up as much of the national budget perhaps, but the thing that really changes with the Liberals is their electoral reforms, their electoral reforms. So they wanted to curb the excesses of elections. So they actually introduced what we have now, which is same-day elections. Because before that, you would have the election would take place over maybe 5 or 6 weeks.
Oh.
So it's really good because you could apply pressure town by town. So you know, say Hamilton goes Conservative, and you're like, okay, but the next town is Petawawa, so we'll all rush out there, and then you slip somebody $5 and buy somebody a beer, and then people's employers, of course, took them to the voting station as well. So you'd have to vote the way your employer voted. So you know, so this same day election is a really big change. Everybody was to have the same franchise. Before this, the provinces could decide who could vote. So you have one law covering everyone for federal elections. Pubs were closed during voting hours to cut down on corruption. You buy a man a beer by his vote. And I was saying to somebody just a little while ago that I used to work at Crazy Eddie's and Crowchild Trail in Calgary, and on election day, when you opened the door after the voting booths closed, it was like people had never, you know, they were like, alcohol! Oh my God, they'd only been closed off from it for like 12 hours, but that was just 12 hours too much. They'd be like, quick, I need 12 beers. Ah! It was crazy. You always got really good tips and stuff because everybody was so desperate. I'm not sure if they do that now or not. MPs had to provide election expense chits, so you get some idea of where the money's coming from and where it's going to. And the secret ballot is introduced. So now, instead of your employer knowing how you're voting or anything, right, you go in, you're like, look how much fun we have at election time, and line up and
stand behind a bit of cardboard.
The bit of cardboard. I'm always disappointed because I always think somebody's going to exit poll me, and nobody ever does, and I'm like, and then it's all over so quickly. In America, you get to pull that wee curtain and everything. I think they have more fun than us.
I think so too.
You know, ours is probably costs less. They can reuse the cardboard.
Fabric's expensive.
Yeah, exactly. So the secret ballot is introduced as well. Really cool. This is the same kind of thing that's happening in Britain as well. But isn't it ironic then that in the first election, with all these great reforms, people vote the Liberals out of power and bring John A. Macdonald back in? That just seems so sad. You do all the hard work, and then they're like, you were too boring. We want the other guy. Please, can we have the other guy? And then nobody can even say, you could say to your blue in the face, oh yeah, no, I voted for you, Alexander. Of course I did. How would he know? It's secret.
That's right.
So it seems kind of sad. The other thing they wanted to do was they wanted to strengthen Canadian autonomy, and they planned to do this with a revision of the militia system and to end patronage in the officer class. And also they called for a military college to be established, which of course is at Kingston, right? The big college at Kingston. In justice, they wanted to earn the practice that the JCPC, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, was the court of highest appeal. Now, they're not successful in that, but he is successful in establishing the Supreme Court of Canada in 1875. So there is actually then there's a highest court of appeal in the land, and then if you lost at the Supreme Court, then you could go to the JCPC, which when we're talking about World War I, we'll see that women, with the Persons case, women appealed to the JCPC. So the Supreme Court of Canada, for the moment, acts as a court of national appeal, and he also tinkered a little bit with the Governor-General's job description, and the sense there was to try and make the Governor-General responsible to the Prime Minister, and this was achieved by removing his power to disallow legislation without consultation with the PM. So you get those kinds of changes. There's some fiscal changes as well, changes to insolvency law, and then there's some moral changes, the little question of alcohol and moral reform.
Was alcohol really that big? We've talked about it a lot, it seems, in the
only
first
because you drink so much.
But was it really that big of a problem?
It seems to have been quite a big problem. Of course, it's funny though, compared to statistics today, you know, when they give you like the top 10 beer drinking countries, it's probably not much worse than it was then. But people, you know, you probably drink more now per man, woman, and child. But in that period, they linked everything. I mean, this is also a period of industrialization. But instead of blaming industrialization for a lot of the problems, they'd be like, oh, well, it's all down to alcohol. You know, people are getting drunk and then they're hurting themselves on the job. That's how women get pregnant. Well, we all know that from, you know, weekends on White Ave. That's just kind of crazy student behavior and babies. So he wanted to give a helping hand to the temperance movement, and it had all the passion and fervor of the anti-smoking campaigns of today. You're not just hurting yourself, you're killing all the children in the house and the car beside you. How could you do that? You're just evil. Or
secondhand drunk.
Yeah, that's right. Or Mothers Against Drunk Driving, for a positive example. So the temperance movement is absolutely fascinating, and you can follow it in Britain and America and Canada, all in this kind of general, maybe 3 or 4 decades worth of time. And the temperance people had like a totally alternative culture. Obviously, if you don't get to spend all your time hanging out in the pubs and just burping, then and you're sober, you gotta, you're gonna want to go back to the pub after a weekend in sober with the wife. So they have like all these, they bring in opera singers from Italy. They start like bands. Everybody in the neighborhood will all be in like a band, and they had music hall performers. Like, it's a huge kind of international thing. They encouraged adults to join choirs, to learn instruments, and also they would have things like walking things, and they'd have like, mystery tours. And this is when bicycling becomes, by the time you get to, I think, the 1890s, bicycling becomes the big craze, and everybody's out cycling all over the place. So there's a whole alternative culture that if you're not going to be a drinker, that you can go to all this other stuff. So it's not just, church socials and Empire biscuits. It's lots of other interesting things too. So I should have looked up what the estimate was now, but the estimate was that 4 gallons of alcohol was consumed every year per man, woman, and child. Yeah. And it was they thought that most criminal activity was associated with alcohol. And of course, the Northwest Mounted Police, when they're created by John A. Macdonald a little earlier on, 1873, they're sent out west to keep the West dry. And a lot of the cases that they're involved in.
Is that so there's more for the East?
No, so it's more for the Mounties, because they were supposed to spill it out on the ground, but people thought that they kept it in secret underground stashes so they could get drunk themselves, which is kind of funny. So the Conservatives were really mad about the temperance bill coming before the House, and on the 3rd reading they went on a drinking binge in the House, and even the Speaker got involved. You're not supposed to, and denounced the bill. And somebody had to be told to button up their trousers, and they filibustered through the night, and then I guess they fell asleep and the bill passed. And so some people could barely stand up during their speeches, but the bill passed. But all it did really was it allowed local areas to decide whether they should be wet or dry, and then there are some cases where an area would become a dry area, and then I think Russell versus the Queen, that's one case when somebody was like, I don't think we should be forced to be a dry area, so we're going to take it to court, and I think that went to the JCPC. But I have a campaign leaflet, and it's obviously from it must be from the 1896 campaign. I shall just hold it up, although I'm sure you can't read it, but it's called What It Costs, and it's just a cracker. It's, I think, 4 pages long. Yes, 4 pages long, and it's the report of the Royal Commission on Liquor Traffic, which estimates the annual expenditure for strong drink in Canada, and just amazing numbers. Taking an average of the quantities of wine, spirits, and malt liquors, so I guess it isn't beer, entered for consumption in the 5 years ending 1893, but excluding cider and native wines, and taking an average of the retail prices, the calculation shows the sum of $39.8 million paid for liquor by the consumer, and more than half of this is paid for spirits, which it's well understood a large addition of water is made before they're vended to the public. So there you go. So $39 million, that's a huge amount of money. So $39 million worth of that. And then they go on to say why this is such a bad thing, that the country's impoverished by the waste of grain used in the manufacture of liquor, that part of it was imported grain, and all the grain destroyed in the liquor manufacture is calculated to be $1.18 million worth of grain in the booze. And then it goes on, if that's not enough, it goes on to talk about the cost of jails, asylums, and poorhouses. And so the amount of people that end up in penitentiaries, jails, asylums, reformatories, almshouses amounts to $6 million. And of that, half of it is chargeable to the liquor habit and the liquor charge. So $3 million for people in jail. Then the loss of labor, they calculate it as some huge amount. I believe that's $76 million. Shortened lives. Life's cut short annually in Canada by intemperance, and each death robbing the country of at least an average of 10 years of productive power. The estimate of loss there annually is 14 million. Then misdirected work, 13,000 men engaged in making and selling liquor, not actually adding anything to the wealth of the country. That comes to $7.7 million. And then it kind of sums up, if you add all this stuff up, so the cost of the liquor traffic comes to $143 million. And the revenue from the liquor traffic only comes to $8 million, and the net loss is $134 million. So the annual charge in 1 year, $134 million. And you asked if it was a big problem or not. Obviously.
Apparently it was.
Obviously, some people have put a little bit of effort into finding out if it was or not. And as I said, it's often blamed for pregnancy, for workplace accidents, for broken homes, for domestic abuse, and all those kinds of things. So yeah, Mackenzie's right in there, you know, with the temperance people going, we can't let this happen. And then first chance at an election, everybody's like, let's get the old drunk back. He was way cooler. Let's get him back. So,
how about that, eh?
Yeah. Kind of crazy.
Yeah, well, while you drink that all in, that should do it for part 2. We'll be back with more in part 3.